Weird news, guys. Redis is no longer open source, at least the open source we know and love, where we can use it, sell it, repurpose it, and do all the things we kind of associate with open source. This caught me so off guard that I'm doing this on an off day. I didn't even have time to get dressed or put on my makeup because I wanted to jump on this as quickly as I could because I'm, to be frank, a little deep in the nerdiness for open source licensing stuff. It's just a thing I have dug into for way too long, and there's a lot to dig into here because this is a weird one, to say the absolute least. So first, we're going to cover what actually happened and read the post from Redis. Then we're going to cover the community response, the things people saw and thought, and their expectations and how those were subverted. And also, of course, the impact on the community and the people building on top of this, companies like Upstash that have went all in on building with Redis. What does this look like for them? And most importantly, at the end, what could they have done to prevent this and what licenses might allow for their goals to be achieved better? Because I don't think they handled this great. Spoiler. Anyways, let's start with this post and see where it brings us. I will also point out that I did way too much research before this one, so we got a lot to cover. Let's do it. Redis adopts dual source available licensing. I love when they make up these new terms. It makes it feel better that they're doing something that they know people will hate, whatever. Future Redis releases will continue to offer free and permissive use of the source code under the dual RSAL v2 and SSPL v1 licenses. These releases will combine advanced data types and processing engines previously only available in the Redis stack. This is them kind of doing damage control here, where they have added new features to Redis and Redis technologies that normally they would sell, but they're now available with the source code, but under this new licensing, which also affects Redis itself. Beginning today, all future versions of Redis will be released with the source available licenses. Notice source available is not open source. The reason for that is the official OSI, the Open Source Standards Committee, does not consider what they've done here open source, so they can no longer call it open source. Starting with Redis 7.4, Redis will be dual licensed under the RSAL license v2 and the server-side public license v1. Consequently, Redis will no longer be distributed under the 3-clause Berkeley software distribution, good old BSD. From day one, Redis has provided a foundation of performance and simplicity for the applications and data infrastructure that power the modern internet. Now, 15 years later, we're proud to serve millions of developers across the globe by supporting real-time applications the world depends on every day. We have already implemented dual licensing for our advanced Redis modules under the Redis Stack distribution, which has been well received by the community. In fact, more than 50% of Redis.io downloads from Redis 6 and beyond come from Redis Stack. We now believe that extending this license to Redis itself will enable us to continue to evolve the most holistic set of data models, processing engines, and developer capabilities for our users. Yeah, if somehow you don't know what Redis is, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, sorry. Redis is an in-memory database. It's primarily a key value store. There's a lot of cool things that it has a lot of awesome, useful functionality on top, but in the end, it's just a key value store. So its popularity, as great as that is, and as useful as Redis is as a tool, the number of problems you can solve with Redis is actually hilarious. That all said, it's hard to build a company around that because anyone can host this basically anywhere. Ronan in chat just said that Redis is basically a hash map as a service, which, yeah, kind of. It's a hash map as an open source thing you can run, but it is also a service through Redis Stack. The thing they're not saying here that is important to understand is that the Redis corporation that makes Redis Stack and is trying to sell their services here, they are losing to a lot of other companies in the space, be it Amazon, be it Upstash, be it Railway. In fact, I wonder, can I go to Railway and start a new project and still deploy Redis? Cool. That button's probably going to go away in the near future. This is what's magic about Redis, though, is you can go anywhere and it's a standard. You can click a button, deploy Redis, and then use it across all your services, which is really, really convenient. And throwing that away genuinely kind of sucks. So why are they doing this? They don't want to keep losing business to these other places, which on one hand, I understand. On the other hand, they're betraying a massive community. And a lot of people feel very much betrayed. There's a great tweet from Theo, who, if you don't know, is one of the lead contributors to Node.js. He's also the co-founder of Platformic. He knows his shit. We don't always agree, but on things like this, almost always we do. Mateo's disappointment comes from Antirez leaving and being promised things that didn't happen. Antirez was the original creator of Redis and was really involved with the company at the time. Since then, he has left, new ownership has taken over, and they originally had promised him that it would stay BSD licensed. This is the blog post of him leaving and the company thanking him for everything he had done. In here, they point out specifically, the core of the open source Redis project will remain under the 3-clause BSD license as expressed by the new government structure for Redis. The project will be guided by a core team of contributors from the community selected according to their involvement and contributions. We believe this moment is an excellent opportunity for the community to contribute, give feedback, and help improve the Redis project. So this paragraph basically is a lie. I've never seen a company walk back this hard in the open source world. It's one thing to change your licenses because you want to make more money, which sucks, but possibly justifiable, especially if you approach it properly. This is not that. On the spectrum of being a good open source contributor to being just an asshole. They lean are very far on the asshole side right now. Let's go back to their post because I want to dig into this a bit more first. The new source available licenses allow us to sustainably provide permissive use of our source code. Permissive use of our source code is a scary term. We're leading Redis into its next phase of development as a real-time data platform with a unified set of clients, tools, and core Redis product offerings. The Redis source code will continue to be freely available to developers, customers, and partners through Redis Community Edition. Community Edition. Yeah. Future Redis source available releases will unify core Redis with Redis Stack, including search, JSON, vector, probabilistic, all the features that their paid service includes. Which, cool, you get these things inside of the core Redis package, but at the same time, you don't get to deploy Redis or this as a service ever again. You can deploy them for your own usage for products, but you cannot use these things as things that your service offers. We'll take a look in a bit about how that impacts companies that I just mentioned, like Railway and Upstash. And of course, they had to mention AI, because of course they did. The success of Redis has created a unique set of challenges. Redis has been sponsoring the bulk of development alongside a dynamic community of developers eager to contribute. However, the majority of Redis's commercial sales are channeled through the largest cloud service providers, who commoditize Redis's investments and its open source community. I hate this. We'll go into ways to balance this out better in the future, but like the incentive structure here sucks. This feels like what PlanetScale did. Oops, we suddenly realized we need to make money, so now we're going to turn our back on the people who got us where we are. Yes and no. On one hand, what PlanetScale did sucks. I totally understand. What they're doing costs them a lot of money actively, not just money for development and iteration, but specifically money for hosting. Providing a free service is very different from providing open source code. And PlanetScale in particular, not only are they really good about open source, the CEO, Sam, has been known for calling out companies that don't actually do open source. I can't tell you how many times I've seen him jump in on stuff like this, where he shames other companies for pretending to be open source when they're not. And PlanetScale has been very, very committed to working with Vitess as an external thing that they don't own, but they meaningfully contribute a lot of eng time, money, and energy and marketing into. Vitess can still be deployed yourself and used for whatever you wanted. If you wanted to go build your own PlanetScale alternative, you can. Their licenses for the Vitess core technology that it's all built on top of is still a viable choice. It's not comparable, and I don't think it's fair to compare these things because PlanetScale had a service they were offering for free that cost them money. They decided to pull it back because it cost them too much money, and they fumbled a lot along the way. I'm not going to pretend they didn't, but the technology underneath it, Vitess, is open source and fully accessible to everybody. Redis is no longer open source and fully accessible to everybody. There are now limitations of who can and can't use it. That is the big deal here. The Redis company, Redis Stack, is not trying to innovate on the quality of experience they provide around Redis. They're trying to make Redis itself that experience they're selling and limit other people who want to compete with them. PlanetScale didn't limit competition with their decisions. In fact, they gave competition a head start in a lot of ways by making those changes. Whereas with what Redis did here, they're saying, no, you can't compete using our technology anymore. Apparently, they had a blog post in 2018 previously. They cited this in the article here. The success of Redis has created a unique set of challenges. Redis has been sponsoring the bulk of development alongside a dynamic community of developers eager to contribute. However, the majority of Redis's commercial sales are channeled through the largest cloud service providers who commoditize Redis investments in open source community. Despite efforts to support a community-led governance model and our desire to maintain the BSD license, delivering multiple software distributions simultaneously across open source available, and commercial software, yada, 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 is at odds with our ability to drive Redis successfully into the future. On one hand, I get this. It seems like they tried, supposedly, to get the community to lead Redis itself and push it forward. They feel like they weren't able to do that, and now we're in utter chaos where they're changing the licensing so they can supposedly continue investing and justifying that investment. Iffy on that. We'll take a look at the BSD thing in a minute. This is a blog post from Antirez, again, the original creator of Redis, stating specifically, Redis will remain BSD licensed. Apparently, they originally added a new common clause license in the Redis Labs site that people were concerned was triggering Redis doing a license switch. He called it explicitly that it is and will remain BSD licensed. However, in the era of uncontrollable spreading of information, my attempts to provide the correct information failed, and I'm still seeing everywhere, Redis is no longer open source. Well, sorry, but Redis is no longer open source as of today. The thing being cited there is a somewhat common occurrence that happened over the last few years where Redis Inc. would send lawyers after companies that branded with Redis slightly too hard, and when they'd have to add a bunch of disclosures on the bottom of their site, like the Redis copyright. Redis is a registered trademark of Redis Ltd. Yeah, it was a whole thing. And people were concerned about these types of things, meaning Redis wasn't open source, which is why Antirez wrote by the way, Redis is still open source. Don't worry about it. I'm tired of this misinformation spreading. 2,038 days ago. Sorry, bud. It sucks that this is the case, but this is now the case. The core point here is that the new license will no longer allow Redis offerings from other companies to be used with their source code. They can't just provide hosted Redis without paying them something, which doesn't really make sense. It's an open source project. All new versions of Redis will be susceptible to these new changes, but you can't change the license of code that's already out there. So old versions are still good, and you should expect people to fork. They always do. We'll go into forks and alternatives to Redis soon. There's a long list of them, some of which are actually very interesting. This is just some bullshit saying that they're excited to keep working with others. They apparently convinced Microsoft to pay extra money to support things like Azure Cache for Redis still, so we'll provide Microsoft customers with exclusive access to expanded features within Redis offerings. I'm honestly a little surprised Microsoft took the opportunity to do anything with this because they lean pretty hard into real open source right now. Like they bought GitHub, they're open sourcing tons of incredible stuff. They pushed Git further than we ever thought it could go. It's honestly surprising that they're letting themselves be involved here simply because it might have bad optics for them to support this in any way. But at the same time, Redis is an important tool in technology. They're choosing to bet on that. I am curious how people feel about Microsoft's involvement here over time, though. In practice, nothing changes for the Redis developer community. Bullshit. And they also point out that all the Redis client libraries under the responsibility of the Redis company will remain open source licensed. Cool. I'm happy that they call out that their license isn't an open source license. That's the one thing I will give them a lot of credit for here. Does Redis still believe in open source? First, we openly acknowledge that this change means Redis is no longer open source under the OSI definitions. Second, we give away more technology than we monetize. Every day, someone is using a free version of Redis in amazing and incredibly innovative ways, and we applaud that. We will continue to invest to ensure that Redis remains a compelling and competitive platform for years to come. I have so many issues with this. It's not just protecting your brand and what do you mean by IP here? Because if by protecting your IP, you mean protecting Redis itself, the open source technology that thousands have contributed to, let's take a look at the GitHub. I'm just curious how many people have contributed to it. 700 people have contributed their code to Redis. And as of today, any further contributions will no longer be open source. If any of those people worked at somewhere like, let's say, Amazon, where they were deploying Redis as a service, the effort they put in and plans they had for future efforts have just been thrown away. There's no longer reason for them to contribute. The theoretical future where others did contribute more is now gone. And while I'm sure the Redis company is contributing a majority of the current work, this is still stupid. Still very stupid. Our new license approach strikes the best balance between making Redis source code broadly available, supporting the developer community with minimal limitations, and protecting our ability to continue investing in feature-rich, free-of-charge software and enterprise products. My first super spicy take is that you can do this right. While in this case, they rug pulled and have a policy that's way too strict, you can do this reasonably. I understand the goal of both being open source and involved in the open source community and being able to monetize the unique innovations and efforts you're putting into these things. Like, how much would it suck if you made an awesome new open source tool, made a service for deploying it that was really good, and Amazon just comes in and takes it from you because AWS is obviously bigger and more reliable as people see it. And as such, if you're competing directly with AWS to AWS customers, you're screwed, especially if they can use the exact same source code. So how do you work around that? Because this license just says, nope, never again. There are balances you can find. I did see one more thing I want to cover, which is that Chad Whitaker wrote an article about the rug pull and relicensing as a whole here. Viable fork materializes relicensing was a rug pull. If not, it wasn't, and that's kind of sad. Another day, another major open source project relicenses to avoid getting jeffed. Oh boy, what's getting jeffed? Jeffing is Amazon stealing your thing because Jeff Bezos. Cool. Makes sense. Jeffing is when Bezos comes and steals the thing you built and sells it for cheaper. That checks out. This time, though, it's Redis. Again, was it a rug pull? It's too soon to tell. It's only a rug pull if someone was standing on the rug. I love that quote. This might be my favorite quote in a minute. Oh boy, I'm already liking where this is going. A brief history of Redis licensing. 2009. After working on it for 3 years, Salvatore publishes Redis core on GitHub under BSD3. Hello, beta testers. This Redis server distribution is just a preview. It is by no means a usable product, but probably it can already give you some feeling about what the final release is going to be. Be aware that if you want to use Redis in production, the server may not be perfectly stable or may contain unfixed bugs. I love the little typos in this. It really makes it feel like a new open source project. It's kind of cute to think in 2009, this little raw text announcement warning was the state of Redis, and now it's where it is now. 2016 is where things ramp up again. Redis starts making modules, licensing them under the AGPL, like Redis Search, Redis JSON, Redis Time Series, all very important things for building on top of Redis. In 2018, Redis relicenses its modules from AGPL to Apache 2.0 with Commons clause. I don't find an announcement from them, but here's a version of events in a TechCrunch op-ed from a VC who was involved. And Redis refers to the 2018 Common Clause relicensing in their 2021 post. So this is the first time they relicensed. Common Clause stops open source abuse from 2018. Again, this is the drama that happened a while back where people thought Redis was no longer open source. This is also the thing people thought wasn't open source originally, which is why we saw that initial response where they said that it will always remain BSD. This was meant to be a response to the people who were concerned about what happened here. And clearly the concerns were correct because they've since fully walked back their defense there. In 2021, the Commons Clause is a fine idea with an unfortunate name. It's a non-compete rider on an otherwise open source license, but a commons is precisely a resource that is governed openly, not corporately. Due in part to related controversy, Redis relicenses modules again to a new license, the non-compete Redis Source Available license, the RSAL. This is the thing they did the V2 of today. In 2022, Redis relicensed the modules again to a dual licensing arrangement, a cleaned up RSAL V2, and in a bid to reduce license proliferation, Mongo's SSPL. Yeah. And then today, well, I guess technically yesterday, after 15 years, core Redis went from BSD3 to the same RSAL SSPL arrangement as the modules. Yeah. Ugh. Criteria for a rug pull. In cases like this, the cry foul goes up. Companies dominate their space by having an open ecosystem and a large community of volunteers and then unilaterally switch the licensing terms from under everyone so that the founding team and VCs can make billions. Well, in this case, the founding team isn't there anymore. Specifically, the guy who made Redis doesn't work there anymore. He left. So yeah, it's people who took it from him, arguably. It's a smooth narrative, but a little too smooth. Not every relicensing is a rug pull because not every project has a large community of volunteers. I will say that there are definitely relicenses that I've seen that were far from a rug pull. In fact, some of them have actually been more open as a result of the relicensing and changes. One example that I'll go deep into later is Sentry and the FSL, the functional source license, which they introduced to address a lot of these problems and honestly solve the issue that Redis is claiming to try and fix here way better than they did. We'll get there in a bit. As he says here, not every project has a large community of volunteers. Unlike Redis, which has over 700 contributors. Moving a rug pull with no one standing on it is not a rug pull. It's just moving a rug. For a relicensing to be a rug pull, there has to have been a true developer community around the project, not just users, developers. Yep, I think that's the case here, pretty obviously. Clearly, HashiCorp pulled the rug because in the wake of their relicensing, which if you're not familiar, they relicensed Terraform to be more restrictive, so you had to use their services with Terraform if you wanted to do things like just sharing your configs. People outside HashiCorp did a lot of work to get OpenTofu off the ground. OpenTofu is a fork of Terraform from when it was still licensed more open, and they were able to run from there. It seems to be viable. On the other hand, since Sentry relicensed in 2019, no viable fork has emerged. This is funny because Sentry's relicensing has generally been in the direction of more open, especially now that they've done the FSL, but we'll get there in a bit. There was no community of people not employed by Functional Software Incorporated doing business as Sentry who were developing the product. There was no one standing on the rug. Yep, also fair. There weren't people adding things to Sentry, deploying Sentry on other services where you could buy it from and all of those things. So when they changed the license, it just fixed a lot of their little issues that, again, we'll talk about in a bit. Percentage of commits by era and relation. Sentry has always been built by Sentry. There's actually a really good photo to reference here. Over 90%. That's a huge difference. So how about Redis? Was Redis's relicensing a rug pull? I don't know. They mentioned efforts to support a community-led governance model and our desire to maintain the BSD license. I eagerly clicked the link regarding their desire. More eagerly would I have clicked to learn about their efforts. Maybe they did make an effort. Maybe they didn't. It's funny. I had the exact same skepticism. Like, we don't know. They didn't show us any effort here at all. Ultimately, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Are there enough people who care enough to launch a viable open source fork of Redis? Technically, yes, they already have. It exists. It's KeyDB. We'll see how many people move to it. Was anyone standing on the rug? In the court of public action, the jury is out. I like this. This isn't about opinions. This is about action. So we need to see what people do. But also, empty rugs are kind of sad. I do have to admit that there's something poignant about yesterday's announcement. I felt a pang of loss when digging up the history shared above. 15 years ago, Salvatore put something beautiful out into the world with a sparkle in his eye and a spring in his step. Redis has always topped my personal list of really elegant pieces of software, alongside Postgres and Python, Vim, maybe even Git. And Salvatore has always seemed like he's got really good energy. When he stepped back 4 years ago, he wrote, "I believe I'm not just leaving Redis in the hands of a community of expert programmers, but also in the hands of people who really care about the legacy of the community spirit of Redis." Yeah. Rip. If no fork emerges, it seems like a death knell for Salvatore's dreams of Redis the community, even while it vindicates the decisions of Redis the company. I felt a similar pang of loss when I watched David say, in reference to Sentry's own relicensing, there's no billion-dollar revenue companies that are exclusively permissive open source. I want to believe someone will do it. At some point, they'll take the leap and it will work. We were not going to be the ones to quite do it. This is a great opportunity to dig into what Sentry has done and take a look at the FSL. So let's do that quick, because as much as I agree with all of this, I don't necessarily feel the same way when I saw the FSL. It did not give me the same gut of, oh no, what's going on here? Last year, Sentry put out the FSL, the functional source license, which again doesn't qualify for traditional open source definitions, but they did something very interesting here, where after a 2-year window, the license converts the code to Apache 2 or MIT licensing, which means that anyone can do whatever they want as long as they're using a version that's 2 years old or older. This is a really good model, in my opinion, because it aligns incentives well, where the company making the software wants to keep innovating, because the more they innovate, the more competitive advantages they have, because they have a 2-year lead whenever they implement something new. So it gives them reasons to keep improving the product and implementing new features and things on top, but it doesn't lock out competition from supporting things on other platforms. I really like the goal of this license. I genuinely think it's a really good idea. It has gotten some controversy, but it's also gotten some strong adoption. Obviously, Sentry's using it for a bunch of stuff, because if you didn't know this already, Sentry's largely open source. They also are being used by Scott Chacon, who, if you don't know, he's currently CEO of GitButler, but he also is the co-founder of GitHub, which means he knows open source. And he found the FSL license was a really good balance. Let's read what he had to say. I'm really struggling with wording here. We released GitButler under the FSL license, which converts to MIT at some point, which is technically not open source as defined by the OSI, but it is source available, and it seems misleading to call it anything different. What do you all think? The FSL is interesting because it's generally permissive outside of the non-compete clause, more so in my thinking than, say, something like the AGPL, which either limits you or forces actions upon you. The BUSL's additional use grant is so complicated in a way that FSL ignores nicely. Yeah, there's all these other licenses like the Elastic license, the BUSL, all these other weird ways to try and give businesses ways to hold some amount of their ability to sell their service. Most of them were really complex and had issues, which is why half of these companies invent their own new terms, similar to what Redis did with the, RSAL and SSPL. They made up new things because, yeah. Back to the post from Scott, because I do think this is really insightful. I've really struggled with this because I love open source software, but I really hate that businesses writing open source software have to compete with large bad actors just taking their stuff. I like the idea of the simplicity of the functional software license converting automatically to MIT after some time and only enforcing non-compete and allowing absolutely everything else, which is what most open source devs really care about. Curious what the community thinks. Is the phrase open source essentially trademarked by the OSI, or can the community generally use it with other permissive licenses if it's in the spirit? This is a conversation about, can you call this open source or not? And it's weird because if this code will be open source, can you call it open source now, or do you have to wait until it gets to that point with that license? And how much do we care about the OSI's definitions? I don't want to go too deep into the semantic arguments here. I really want to focus on the goals of these companies and the reasons they implemented things the way they did, because what they did here was very specific and poignant. It solves the problem that Redis claimed they were trying to solve today, of companies just taking the stuff that they built, reselling it for slightly cheaper, and making way too much money on top of that when you get nothing when you're the one building and contributing all the effort to the thing. If you're contributing enough effort to keep the thing innovative and interesting such that every year there's cool new features you want to use, that's the edge you compete on. And the cool thing with the FSL is it incentivizes the companies making these open source tools to continue innovation so that there's reasons for customers to use their implementations rather than the 2-year-old version being hosted by Amazon. This is, I really think, the right solution to the problem. They still got a lot of shit for it, but overall, I really like the vibe here. It's funny to think that Sentry started in 2008 as just a Django plugin that was 71 lines of code. They originally were BSD3. They switched to the business source license, which was not ideal for a lot of what they wanted to do. They purchased code coverage, which they published the source code for under BSL again. This led to some vigorous debate because our use of the term open source to describe code coverage was spicy with the BSL. I think the way forward here is to make what I suspect is a loose confederation of folks using non-compete licenses to actually get together and draft their own set of values, to then brand that and stand behind it proudly. Yeah, I think that's fair. Functional source license is nice and simple and a good solution here. FSL is an evolution of BSL that deepens our commitment to balancing user freedom and developer sustainability. We think it's a compelling option for open source minded SaaS companies such as ourselves who wish to grant freedom without harmful free riding. Yeah, the big thing with BSL is that the weight was absurd. It's way too complex, and it's I would say quite a bit further from what we expect from open source. One of the other interesting things here is that Sentry's actually sponsoring research into DOSP, which is the delayed open source publication policies that they're leaning into here, because they want to better understand how we got here and what we'll actually use these things for. As for the big flaws BSL has, it's 4 years, which is way too long and disincentivizes innovation, because if you do one interesting thing every 4 years, you have no reason to keep innovating on the product, which sucks. The more serious flaw, though, is that it has way too many parameters. The change date, the change license, the additional use grant. Yeah, the additional use grant is a giant fill in the blank that means every BSL is entirely different from each other, which is kind of why what happened here happened. I don't know if it's BSL based. I'm actually pretty sure it isn't. We can take a look at the license. I'm actually curious. Not even say the word business on the page. That's my biggest concern here more than anything, is just the level of walk back we've seen here is absurd. I've never seen a company pretend they were on one side and move to the other. To again compare it to what Sentry did with the FSL, they started with a more restrictive license with the business source license, and they've moved to less and less restrictive licenses. Going more restrictive when you've promised to never do that is absurd. Actually fucking insanity like I've never seen, and it's going to tank their reputation. This is the PR where the license change actually happened, and some chatters pointed out I should definitely look at it. Not just because of the upvote to downvote ratio, which is absurd, but because there's some really good points being made by contributors. This contributor commented that their contributions were made open source under the BSD license. You are not allowed to redistribute nor use them in source or binary forms without the original copyright notice and the BSD license. You must remove my contributions. This is an interesting thing to point out, because on one hand, if I had BSD licensed code that was public and put basically anywhere, and someone else wanted to use that code, they can, but they have to make sure that the BSD license for my piece that they took is included there to make it clear that this part is, without question, part of the BSD license clause. This is when you're taking code from one project to another. At least that's most of the intent here. The thing that's interesting here is what happens when a contribution to a project is made when the license is one way and then the license changes. None of this has gone to court. Nobody's really challenged these things. We can all interpret and shout about how we think these things do work or should work. That all said, the idea that you can contribute code, never actually enforce a CLA or anything like that to strictly define like, hey, I'm agreeing you changing the license isn't something I'm going to fight back on. They never had anyone sign anything when they contributed to Redis. All of this code was contributed in a free BSD open source license. So you could make a very fair and strong argument that anyone who contributed under that license has contributed work that's license is being changed without their permission. And you see that a lot throughout here. There's a couple other commenters who have said roughly the same. As a copyright holder, you might consider pursuing a DMCA process towards the files with mangled license headers. This is a fair point to point out. Another person said here that they committed this specific commit, which allowed Redis modules to function with modern compilers, which was made under the BSD license, and they are not granting the permission for it to be used under any other license. Copyright for changes in this commit is held by their employer, which happens to also be Red Hat. Very, very interesting. No one signed a CLA for Redis, right? Like we've confirmed that. Yeah, Redis Labs used a CLA for many of their other Redis-related projects, but not for Redis itself, which means that this license change might actually not stand up if someone was to theoretically sue or go after them for it. And to see an actual employee of not just like any company, but a big open source Linux company that's very deep in these things, calling out that their employer, Red Hat, is the copyright holder for this stuff. That is terrifying. I would not want to be working at Redis Labs right now. Supposedly this person contributed a lot. They committed to this repository in the past month. 80 commits from this individual. And those are mostly recent too, like starting in 2021, it looks like. Yeah. So halfway through 2021, up until now, they've been a somewhat regular contributor to Redis. And they were contributing because they thought the code they were contributing is and was and would stay open source. 80 commits is not trivial to remove. And if they would like to remove his contributions, they have a lot of work to do because a lot of that's going to be functionality people rely on. And now they have to re-implement it in a way that isn't copying that exact code he contributed before, which is really hard to do. That's time he lost that he'll never get back. That's effort his employer theoretically spent that is no longer part of a license that he agreed to. Like imagine that he worked at a company that was selling Redis as a service and contributed these things to make Redis better so that they could make better things with it. And now they're not allowed to do that with future versions. That's insane. This is actually a very interesting point too. Are you aware that you've just removed Redis from the vast majority of Linux distributions? This is a very bad decision that will not end well for you in the end. Look at Elasticsearch versus OpenSearch, MySQL versus MariaDB, Oracle JDK versus OpenJDK, OpenOffice, LibreOffice, etc. Yeah, that's a fair point I hadn't thought of, is like you're just not going to include Redis in Linux anymore because whenever you have licensed things like this, you can't. This has been a problem for a while for something like ZFS. If you're not familiar, it's a file system that has questionable licensing, and it's a big part of why the Linux kernel doesn't support it because the license isn't as open and permissive as the license for Linux itself. Thereby, implementing any functionality for it would be supporting a thing that isn't within their license terms. This is fair. all the critiques here are actually worthwhile, and I've been impressed with the level of contribution happening from non-employees. If we go back to the contributors, let's just take a look at the people who have contributed the most recently. Obviously, Antirez basically stopped when he left. It's actually pretty alarming how quickly his commits just died, but Oring has taken over since. He's a member of Redis, so I'm assuming he's part of the core team. Peter hasn't done anything for a while. So the current second biggest recent contributor to Redis doesn't even work at Redis. He works at Tencent. And we see Yosingo here. Does he work at Redis? There's enough Redis Lab stuff here. I have to assume he does. Alibaba, who doesn't? Okay, so literally counting the recent contributors that are actually shipping meaningful amounts of code, half of them don't work at Redis Labs. And one of them quit on the terms that the license would never change. This is looking more and more like a slap in the face to the entire community of people who contributed here. I mean this wholeheartedly. Nothing I say about any of this drama matters more than what the people who contributed and put hard work and time into this project say. How they feel matters way more than any readings I do about any of these rules, any of these licenses, any of the legal standings any of these things have. Nothing matters more than the feelings of the contributors who made this project viable in the fucking first place. And if they feel burnt, which by all accounts, it seems like they very much do, then this was a mistake. Period. They can claim they're the ones spending all the money and time making this happen, but I've just proven here that Tencent and Alibaba are also spending a lot of time making this viable and possible. It's just a lie. And if these people feel burnt, if the people making this project work feel burnt, then they got burnt. Period. We should talk about the impact though, because thankfully a lot of the things I rely on will not be impacted. And if I've learned anything from this, is that people don't actually use Redis that much because Redis kind of sucks. We'll get into that in a bit. But first I want to shout out Upstash. If you guys don't know Upstash, they sponsored the channel a bunch before. They're technically not sponsoring me right now, but I do love them and working with them has been great. They also just hired Josh Tried Coding, who's another great software dev, web dev focused YouTuber, and he's been killing it over there. So obviously I'm biased. I like these guys, know that. I thought this was hilarious. The license restrictions on Redis will not impact the features of any Upstash product. Upstash for Redis is a custom key value store implementation that is compatible with the Redis API. They are Redis compat. They aren't Redis, which is a very, very important detail right now. We implemented everything from scratch without using any code from Redis open source projects. And then my favorite part, our legal team is currently investigating if these changes will affect our product's name. Yeah, they're going to have to worry about where they put Redis in their stuff, like the word, not the functionality, just the word, because they're not using Redis. In fact, I've never used any of Redis's clients before. I just use the Upstash stuff. If you take a look at Upstash's GitHub, you'll see they have a bunch of Redis clients, specifically the Upstash Redis core client, which is an HTTP-based Redis client that is not going to be affected by any of this because it's their own separate thing that happens to be compliant and compatible with the Redis standards. This is how I use Redis. So this is, again, why I am not affected and why Upstash isn't. I also want to be clear that Upstash isn't the only option. As I was hinting at before, not too many people are actually using Redis directly nowadays. I just found this interesting Hacker News post from last year where people were citing and comparing these different options. Very interestingly, you have quite a few others, all of which are hilariously faster than Redis. Crazy to think that an in-memory store can be slow, but when you write bad code, basically anything can be slow. And while it is obviously faster than like a SQL database that's storing things in files, it's not going to be as fast as something that's written well and multi-threaded, like KeyDB, which if you're not familiar, which I wasn't before all of this, beyond having a vague idea that it existed, KeyDB is an open source alternative to Redis that's actually a fork of Redis. But importantly, it's multi-threaded, which means it can theoretically perform hilariously better, which is what we see here. It's more than twice as fast. There's also solutions like Dragonfly and Skytable, which the author here notes are still new and not as stable, claiming to be way faster, which he couldn't reproduce, but it's also missing a decent number of features. KeyDB overall is very caught up and is probably the best bet right now. This is going to be a huge moment for KeyDB, both like the community and services deploying it, and I'm excited to see where people go with it. Oh, somebody pointed out the article's actually 2 years old. Yeah, I'm stupid. This is a 2-year-old post. You guys get the point. There's lots of other really compelling options you can consider at this point. It's a full-on drop-in replacement. So if you're already deploying Redis or using something like it in production, you can switch to KeyDB if you choose to and be fine. If you're currently selling Redis as a service, you can probably just move to KeyDB and none of your users will even notice. I did see one more interesting take here where someone was upset that people are concerned about this. Specifically, they cited MongoDB as an example of a company that changed their license and was fine. It's interesting they actually used the SSPL as well. I thought that was a thing that was mostly made up by Redis here, but I guess there are actually companies using it. They're using the Mongo license. Very interesting. I didn't know the SSPL was originally by Mongo. Makes sense though, because as I'm sure y'all who have been around for a while know, I would never recommend Mongo. There's a lot of reasons why. And honestly, this is one of them. I will say this has worked well for Mongo as a business. I don't know many users of MongoDB that aren't using their notoriously not great cloud product. So it worked in that sense. I don't think they've gained a whole lot of new Mongo users since they made these changes, but at the very least, they can monetize the few that they have. Good for them, I guess. I hate this. And the fact that people are saying, well, the users are fine. Yeah, they're fine because no real users are using Mongo. And on top of that, the people who are either self-deploying it or relying on the questionable Mongo Atlas product. There just wasn't as much adoption of Mongo in other services. And if they wanted to have any chance of people using Mongo, the service provider, instead of like, I don't know, AWS hosting Mongo databases for you, the only way they had a chance at that was doing this, which is kind of absurd. It's kind of very absurd. Yeah, I also think the competition in this space ramped up a bunch after Mongo did this, where things like DynamoDB got taken way more seriously as a document store because no one could just deploy Mongo anymore, and Amazon needed to compete. So on one hand, innovation happened because of this, which is cool to incentivize innovation. But on the other hand, I do think this kind of tanked Mongo sentiment forever, and I just don't have people asking me about it anymore. In 2018, everyone was asking, should we use Mongo? Can I try Mongo? How do I use Mongo with X? That all died, and this is part of why. This is without a question part of that. When you change these licenses and you restrict these terms, your placement and involvement in the open source community has to go down with that. It just does. Things like this suck. They're not simple, and a lot of people are going to feel burnt for good reasons. On top of that, we got a lot to deal with as a community here, both about how do we handle license changes like this, and also what do we do about Redis? Do we just go to a fork or do we do something different? I don't know. I want to know your guys' thoughts. Let me know in the comments how you feel about this. Are we overreacting, or do we really need to move off of Redis and move to a more open future? I don't know what else to say, so until next time, peace nerds.